Good afternoon and welcome to our study of the book of Genesis. Today we're in Genesis chapter 14. As we continue our look at the life of Abram, we see many firsts in this chapter. It is the first record of warfare. It is Abram's first appearance on the so-called international stage. Abram is first called a Hebrew. Now all those who are descended from Eber are Hebrews. Those descended from Jacob are Israelites. Those descended from Judah after the exile in Babylon are Jews. So technically it is anachronistic to refer to Abram as a Jew. He lived before that distinction came about. Abram has his first contact with a non-Israelite priest, the first priest in the Scriptures, who believes in the one true God. We also have the first oath in Scripture. This chapter has its own unique nature among the events in Genesis, relative to history, geography, and ethnicity. Without counting the names, 4.5% of the vocabulary is unique in the Bible to this chapter. 6.5% of its vocabulary is rare in the Bible, and so this is a unique chapter. Even if we cannot identify the kings from secular history or all the peoples mentioned there is an air of authenticity to the account. That is, all that can be identified so far reflects that geography and that time period. For example, the kings' names fit the geography. Several times, place names are brought up to date, for example in verses 2, 3, 6, and 7, which suggest a lapse of time between the real events and the reading of their record by the next generation. It is important to remember when it comes to archaeology that the absence of evidence does not mean the evidence of absence. In other words, just because archaeologists cannot locate a village in the dirt of Palestine or a person's name in written records, it does not mean that they never existed. They just haven't been found yet. So let's read the text, chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. It happened in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, made war against Berah, king of Sodom, and against Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these allied at the valley of Siddim, this is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year Kedorlaomer came, and the kings which were with him, and they defeated Rephaim, and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim and Ham, and the Emim and Shavah Kiriathaim, and the Horites in Mount Seir, as far as El Paran, which is toward the desert. Shinar is the region of Babylon. Elasar is found only here in Genesis chapter 14. We do not know where it was located. At one time, Elam stretched from the Caspian Sea east to the Persian Gulf. Its capital was Susa, as we find in Esther chapter 1, verse 2. It was a powerful state in the early 2nd millennium BC. Goyim literally means peoples. Perhaps here it means a specific people, but we're not sure who it was. Or it could mean this king was over a coalition of much smaller people groups. The path these kings took from a generally north to south direction came to be known as the King's Highway, which traveled east of the Jordan River from the Dead Sea in the south to Syria in the north. These kings have not been identified from non-biblical sources. One king, Kedorlaomer, subjugated these peoples for a dozen years, but freedom stirs deep in the heart of man. Once the kings rebelled, Kedorlaomer assembled an alliance and fought against the kings in order to re-subjugate them. The focus of Moses' audience, the first audience of the book of Genesis, will be God's treatment and protection of Abram, as well as this enigmatic person by the name of Melchizedek, which we'll discuss below. Let's read verses 7 through 12. Then they settled, and they came to En-Mishpat, this is Kadesh. And they conquered all the field of the Amalekites, and even the Amorites were settling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom went out, and the king of Gomorrah. and the king of Adamah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela. This is Zoar. And they joined with them in battle in the valley of Siddim. Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, and Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against the 5. And the valley of Siddim, with pits and pits of bitumen, and they fled, the king of Sodom and of Gomorrah, and they fell there, and the rest fled toward the mountain. So they took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and they went away. They took Lot and his possession, the son of the brother of Abram, and they went away, and he was dwelling in Sodom. The word pits is found repeated in this verse, suggesting many pits. Bitumen was first seen in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 3, and the only other text will be Exodus chapter 2, verse 3. Bitumen holds asphalt together, and asphalt is found in liquid form in the southern area of the Dead Sea. Petroleum oozes to the surface in some areas. This paragraph is a second round of battles which draws in the inhabitants of Sodom more closely. The key concern for the reading audience of the book of Genesis is the relative of Abram, Lot. Lot is again identified as Abram's nephew here in order to explain why Abram does what he does. If Lot was living on the outskirts of Sodom, he is now living in Sodom, and he is kidnapped along with his possessions and family. The text says the kings fell into bitumen pits, but the king of Sodom is later seen in the account in chapter 14 and verse 17, in which case the word fell suggests either that they jumped into the pits to hide without any further harm coming to them, or the armies in general fell into the pits, but the king himself did not. We saw back in chapter 13, verse 13, that the men of Sodom were evil and extreme sinners. If Lot had had stronger moral sensibilities, perhaps he would have moved further away and would not have been kidnapped with the others. Evil surroundings bring suffering to the righteous sometimes. God will frequently require Israel to avoid evil companionship. Their relative Lot should have been an example to them. Verses 13 through 16. Then the fugitive came and announced to Abram the Hebrew, and he was dwelling among the great trees of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol, and brother of Aner, and these were possessors of a covenant with Abram. Again, the word Hebrew is an ethnic term. As I mentioned in the introduction, Eber's descendants were known as Hebrews. Jacob's descendants were known as Israelites. Judah's descendants after the exile were known as Jews. The phrase I have translated in verse 13, possessors of a covenant, is not found anywhere else, and it gives us the understanding of covenant as an agreement, if not a treaty in a legal sense. Verse 14, Abram heard that his brother was captured, and he led out the trained men born in his house, 318, and they pursued as far as Dan. First, we see here the word brother, referring to Lot, is using the word brother in a broad general sense. Secondly, we see that Abram and the covenant with Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner allows Abram to lead an army of 318 trained men. Now, the phrase trained men is a loan word from the Egyptian language. Verse 15. Then he divided against them at night, he and his servants, and he defeated them, and he pursued them as far as Hobah, which is northward to Damascus. And he brought back every possession, and also Lot his brother, and his possession he brought back, and also the women and the people. A fugitive escaped and informed Abram. It is likely that Abram would not have responded if it weren't for his nephew Lot being kidnapped as well. Again, Lot is called the brother of Abram in verses 14 and 16 in a broad generic term, meaning relative. Abram was living near allies, possessors of a covenant, with Abram, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner. Perhaps this covenant carried with it some legal obligations, such that the men joined in battle with Abram. But he and his 318 men are the focus of the text. Since Abram had 318 trained servants, he likely had a very large household, perhaps over 1,000. The precise number is difficult to estimate, but it lends historicity to the whole account. There is no battle, however, described. Abram and his men were quite successful, even pushing the invaders out of the Promised Land, if Dan is the same Dan of later fame, north of the borders of Israel. The battle was quick, and Abram freed Lot and all the possessions. That word has been emphasized in the text because it plays an important role at the end of the chapter in Abram's dealings with both Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. Abram had faith in God and fought against these kings and conquered them decisively. We do not know how many men were on the opposing forces, so we do not know if Abram was in a position of strength or not. We do know that those who cursed Abram's family were cursed in return, Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Many of these nations are found again in the days of Moses. Abram was successful in battle against them with only 318 men. When Moses' contemporaries invade the Promised Land under Joshua with a considerably larger army, they would also be successful if they were to fight with the faith Abram had. Verses 17 through 20. Then the king of Sodom went out to meet him after he returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings which were with him to the valley of Shaveh. This is the valley of the king. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought bread and wine, and he was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed is Abram before God Most High, owner of the heavens and the earth, and blessed is God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth from all. The phrase God Most High is found in this context in verses 18, 19, 20, and 21, and also Psalm 78, verse 35. I'll talk about more on God's new name in just a moment. Melchizedek, as I mentioned, is the first priest mentioned in the Old Testament, and his priesthood, will serve an important role under the law of Moses. The priesthood in general will serve as an important role under the law of Moses. The word owner in verse 19 is a cognate word with the name Cain. The verb to own is used 85 times in the Old Testament. The abstract noun purchase is used 15 times, while the concrete noun property or possession is found another 10 times. The noun translated owner could also be interpreted as creator. The word tenth, or tithe, rather, literally means 1/10. And so it is wrong to ask somebody how much they tithe. That shows an ignorance of the definition of the word itself. It means 1/10. It appears that the king of Salem and the king of Sodom both met Abram at the same time. Melchizedek presents Abram with bread and wine, to which he would have had ready access as both a priest and king. Melchizedek blesses Abram in fulfillment of God's promise in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Melchizedek's name literally means king of righteousness, and the city over which he was king is named Salem, which is related to the word peace. Both designations are appropriate for the son of David. It was common in the ancient Near East to combine both royal and priestly offices. In fact, it was a distinguishing trait of Israelite religion for the two to be separated. The priest came from the tribe of Levi, the royalty, as we will see, from the tribe of Judah. The Hebrew writer will argue in chapter 7, verse 14, that because Jesus was born from the tribe of Judah, he could not serve as a priest unless the law of Moses were to be fulfilled and taken out of the way, which is what Jesus did on the cross, Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. This is the first time God, or Jehovah, has been given another name, or designation, God Most High. The word El, God, is a shortened form of the previously widely used word for God, Elohim. The origin of the word is not known, but it can mean God in a generic sense. Most High comes from the word to ascend. And so all monotheism outside of Abraham was not dead. Melchizedek is a monotheistic priest of the Most High God, and he blesses Abram for his work in freeing the captives. The Most High God is the owner of heaven and earth. The word again could also be translated creator. To bless God is to recognize the blessings that come from God. Now, tithing was ancient and widespread in the ancient Near East. Once again, out of gratitude for a safe delivery of himself, his 318 citizen soldiers, and Lot and his possessions and family, Abram gives 10% of his war plunder to Melchizedek. the whole scene shows that Melchizedek is of a higher stature than Abram, which is what the Hebrew writer tells us in chapter 7, verses 4 through 6. This will set the stage for the Hebrew writer to argue that the priesthood of Levi, of the nation of Israel, descendants of Abram, are actually inferior to the priesthood of Melchizedek. Psalms 110 is based on Genesis 14. It is the only other Old Testament text which mentions Melchizedek. This significant text ties the descendant of David, the son of David, to the priestly order of Melchizedek. The rabbis will debate that connection until Jesus of Nazareth solves the conundrum. Zechariah, in chapter 6, verses 11 through 13, would picture the Messiah as a priest reigning on his throne. While Melchizedek is only found in Hebrews chapter 5, 6, and 7, Psalms 110 is the most quoted and most frequently alluded psalm in the New Testament. When Melchizedek blessed Abram, we see the first of a series of non-Israelites who see God working in Abram's descendants: Joshua, Ruth, Naaman. These set the stage for non-Jews to come to Jesus, which culminates in the gospel being offered to everyone, both Jews and Gentile. The word tithe is only used in the New Testament 9 times and always refers to the Jewish practice. Christians are never commanded by Christ or his apostles to give 10%. Verses 21 through 24. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give to me the soul and the possession. Take for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I raise my hand to Jehovah God, Most High, owner of heavens and earth." The phrase "I raise my hand" is another way of saying "I swear." Verse 23. Not a thread, or even the thong of a sandal I will not take from all which belongs to you, so you will not say I enriched Abram, except only what the young men ate and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. These will take their share. Abram is the conqueror, and he has the right to keep the spoils of battle for himself. He's given 10% to Melchizedek. He then graciously leaves the rest to the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom comes across more blunt, if not rude, than Melchizedek. He wants people, but not the possessions. But when it comes to the king of Sodom, Abram is not the least bit interested in keeping anything, neither a thread nor a sandal thong. His citizen soldiers can keep what they have used, including his allies, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, but the rest will remain with the king of Sodom. Abram's trust is in God. Incidentally, Abram acknowledges here that the Most High God of Melchizedek's faith is one and the same as Jehovah God of Hebrew faith. We do not know how confident Abram was in his own future after this battle, but God will appear in the very next chapter, in verse 1, to strengthen Abram's faith. Abram is not after accumulating wealth as it appears in the king of Sodom is, and this is an indication of the type of people who live in Sodom, who will be punished by God in Genesis chapter 19. And Abram will have to come to Lot's rescue once again. Thank you for joining me for this study of Genesis chapter 14.